The silence was the first thing. Not an absence of sound, but the presence of a manufactured quiet so profound it pressed against the eardrums. It was the sound of filtered air moving through invisible vents, the sub-audible hum of dormant server banks, the sterile heartbeat of a building holding its breath. Elian felt it as a physical weight, a pressure behind his eyes. He had worked in the archive for 7 years, and in that time he had learned to translate the building's silences. This one was different. This was the quiet of anticipation, the quiet of a predator. He kept his eyes fixed on the light slate grey of his desk terminal, the lines of archaic code scrolling upward in a soothing, predictable cascade. Each character was a known quantity, a piece of a logical, manageable world. Here, history was sanitized, reduced to metadata and access logs. Here there was no scent, no touch, no unpredictable biology. He had built his life on this foundation of sterile order, a carefully constructed fortress against the chaos of his own nature. A soft chime, barely audible, echoed from the frosted glass door at the end of the long, narrow hall. It was a sound he had never heard before. All communication within the archive was digital, silent. A physical summons was an anomaly, a disruption to the carefully calibrated ecosystem. He watched as Ilias, 3 desks down, flinched, his own placid Omega instincts ruffled by the unexpected. But the summons was not for Ilias. His name, bloomed in soft white light on the glass. Elian Thorne. Floor 117. The code on his screen blurred. Floor 117. The executive level. The nest. No one from the archive ever went to the 117th floor. They were the digital ghosts of Vance Biometrics, the curators of its past, not participants in its present. He felt a tremor begin in his hands, a low-frequency vibration he fought to still by pressing his palms flat against the cool surface of his desk. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was data, a file, a carefully maintained record of unremarkable compliance. That was his shield. He had paid for it every month for 15 years, the cost of the suppressants a constant, draining tithe to the god of normalcy. They muted his scent, leveled his hormones, and wrapped his omega biology in a thick, grey blanket of chemical neutrality. He was a ghost in his own body, and he had crafted that existence with painstaking precision. The walk to the elevator was a study in controlled movement. He kept his stride even, his gaze forward, his breathing measured. He could feel the curious, anxious glances of the other archivists on his back, but he did not acknowledge them. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge the abnormality, to give it power. The elevator was a glass cylinder that ascended through the hollow core of the Vance Tower. As it rose, the city unfurled below him, a sprawling circuit board of light and shadow. From the sterile quiet of the archive in the building's foundation, he was now ascending into the rarefied air of the apex predators. Each floor he passed was a different world. Labs filled with white-coated technicians, marketing suites with holographic displays, legal departments paneled in dark, imposing wood. Then, above the 100th floor, the design shifted. The floors became more Spartan, the spaces wider, the light cooler. This was where the alphas worked. The air itself seemed to change, growing thinner, charged with an unspoken static of power and ambition. The elevator chimed softly as it arrived at 117, the doors sighing open onto a vast, empty lobby of polished black marble. The only feature was a single desk, a seamless piece of obsidian, behind which sat a woman who looked as if she had been carved from the same material. She did not look up from her console. "Mr. Vance is expecting you," she said, her voice a cool, toneless murmur. A section of the marble wall behind her slid away, revealing a corridor bathed in soft, indirect light. The air here was different again, colder, sharper. It carried a scent so faint it was almost subliminal, something clean and metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike. It cut through the chemical fog of his suppressants like a razor, and a primal, long-dormant part of him recoiled. His heart rate kicked up a notch. The corridor ended at a pair of towering doors made of smoked glass. They slid open as he approached, granting him entry into an office that seemed to occupy the entire corner of the building. 2 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a god's-eye view of the sprawling metropolis. The city was a silent, glittering spectacle, its chaos rendered beautiful and insignificant by distance. A man stood with his back to him, looking out at the view. He was tall, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. Even from behind, the sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. It was in the confident set of his shoulders, the stillness of his posture. This was Kalen Vance, the CEO, the prime alpha whose corporation held the patent on Elian's manufactured peace. He did not turn. "The scan was this morning," Vance said. His voice was deep, resonant, a finely tuned instrument of command. It filled the cavernous space without effort. "A mandatory, system-wide biosignature update. You were flagged." Elian's blood went cold. The scan. He'd thought it was routine, another piece of bureaucratic data harvesting. He had trusted his suppressants, the 15 years of unbroken, high-dose regimen. He said nothing. In a room like this, with a man like this, silence was the only armor he had. "Your pheromonal signature is unusual," Vance continued, still not turning, "almost entirely dormant, yet the underlying genetic markers are exceptionally potent. A paradox." He finally turned, and Elian felt the full force of his attention. Kalen Vance's eyes were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray that seemed to see not just him, but the carefully constructed walls around him and the terrified thing cowering behind them. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, his features sharp and precise. There was no warmth in his expression, only a calm, analytical curiosity. "Compatibility testing is automated," Vance stated, as if reciting a technical specification. "My profile is permanently active in the system, a necessary precaution. The algorithm cross-references any new scan that exceeds a 90% match threshold. In 10 years, the highest match I have received was 74.3%, a statistically significant but functionally inadequate number." He took a step closer. The faint scent of ozone and cold metal grew stronger, and Elian had to physically lock his knees to keep from stepping back. A shiver, unwelcome and alien, traced a path down his spine. "Your result was 99.8%, Vance said, his voice dropping slightly, the clinical tone fraying at the edges with something that might have been wonder, or perhaps just disbelief. "A statistical impossibility. An error in the system, I assumed, so I ran it again. Manually." He paused, his grey eyes fixed on Elian's face. The result was identical. Elian felt a wave of dizziness. 99.8%. The number was meaningless, and yet it meant everything. It was a death sentence for the life he had built. It was the biological imperative he had spent his entire existence trying to outrun, quantified and staring him in the face. "I don't understand what you want from me," Elian managed to say, his voice a dry rasp. Vance gave a small, humorless smile. It did not reach his eyes. "Oh, I think you do. You have spent a considerable amount of resources, nearly 40% of your net income for the last 15 years, according to your file, to avoid this exact conversation. You have done an admirable job of hiding, of making yourself invisible, but you cannot hide from mathematics." He walked over to his desk, a vast expanse of the same black material as the lobby. He touched its surface, and a holographic interface bloomed in the air. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a document gliding through the space between them. It stopped, hovering in front of Elian. It was a contract, a bonding contract, but it was unlike any he had ever seen. The clauses were not about cohabitation or asset merging or procreation. They were about data access, neurological synchronization, and pheromonal regulation. It read like a corporate merger, not a union of two people. "This is not a courtship, Mr. Thorne," Vance said, his tone returning to its cool, business-like precision. "I have no interest in the archaic rituals of mating. What I have an interest in is optimization, synergy. A bond of this statistical magnitude would create a closed biological and neurological feedback loop. It would eliminate external static, enhance focus, increase productivity and cognitive function for both parties exponentially. It would be efficient. Efficient. The word hung in the cold air, obscene in its clinical detachment. Elian looked from the terrifyingly sterile contract to the terrifyingly controlled man offering it. He saw now that the office, the suit, the voice, they were all part of the same system of absolute control. And Kalen Vance wanted to add Elian to his collection of optimized assets. "No," Elian said. The word was small, fragile, but it was his. Vance's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, surprise, irritation, passed through his eyes. "I don't believe you understood me. This is a transaction. I am prepared to be generous." He gestured to a blank line on the contract, glowing with a soft, inviting light. "Name your price." Elian stared at the glowing line. He could write anything there. A fortune that would ensure he never had to work in the archive again. A life of unimaginable luxury. But all he could see was the cage it represented, gilded though it may be. He thought of his small, quiet apartment, his books, the anonymous life he had fought so hard to maintain. It was a grey existence, but it was his. He lifted his gaze to meet Vance's. "There is no price," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I am not for sale." For the first time, a genuine emotion broke through Kalen Vance's composure. It was not anger. It was a profound, almost chilling sense of disbelief, as if a calculator had just insisted that 2 + 2 = 5. He looked at Elian not as a person who had refused him, but as a problem, a variable that was not behaving according to its programming. The manufactured silence of the office pressed in again, heavier than before. It was no longer the quiet of anticipation. It was the quiet of a system that had encountered an error and was now calculating the most efficient way to correct it. Kalen Vance processed the word "no" as he would a corrupted data packet. It was an anomaly that disrupted a logical sequence. He had anticipated negotiation, hesitation, even fear. He had prepared contingencies for all of them. Financial incentives, security assurances, a gradual integration protocol. He had not, however, prepared for a simple, flat refusal. It was illogical. The Omega before him, Elian Thorne, was a low-level archivist. His net worth was negligible. His social standing was non-existent. He lived a life of deliberate obscurity, pouring a significant portion of his meager income into suppressants that denied his own biology. Kalen had offered him a way out of that grey, circumscribed existence. He had offered him wealth, protection, a connection that was a biological certainty. The refusal was not just defiance, it was irrational. "You are operating under a misapprehension, Mr. Thorne," Kalen said, his voice a model of calm reason. He folded his hands on the obsidian desk, a gesture of placid control. "You believe you are choosing freedom, but the life you lead is not freedom. It is a cage of your own making. You pay to be numb. You work in a basement, curating the dead past. You have no meaningful connections. Your freedom is isolation." He watched the man for a reaction. There was a subtle tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible clenching of his jaw. Good. The logic was landing. The words were finding their targets. "The bond I am offering is not a cage," Kalen continued, pressing the advantage. "It is a paradigm shift, a biological upgrade. The synergy from a 99.8% match would unlock latent potential in both of us. My cognitive acuity would sharpen. Your system would no longer be at war with itself. No more suppressants, no more fighting your own nature. Perfect balance, perfect health. You would not be my possession. You would be my partner in a symbiotic system of unparalleled efficiency." Elian's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a dark, defiant light. "You speak of my body as if it's a piece of hardware you want to upgrade." The accusation was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. It was, of course, entirely accurate. That was precisely how Kalen saw it. He saw the whole world as a system to be analyzed, understood, and optimized. Biology was the most complex and inefficient system of all, and the bond was the ultimate hack, a way to impose order on its inherent chaos. "I speak of it with respect for its potential," Kalen countered smoothly. "A potential you are actively squandering." He brought up Elian's file on the holographic interface again, turning it so they could both see it. He highlighted the medical history. 15 years of high-dose hormonal suppressants. The long-term effects are well documented. Neurological degradation, early-onset osteoporosis, a significantly increased risk of cardiovascular failure. You are not preserving yourself, Mr. Thorne. You are slowly, methodically destroying yourself. For what? A principle? An illusion of autonomy? He saw a flicker of genuine fear in Elian's eyes then, and he knew he had him. Fear was a powerful motivator. Fear was logical. "I am offering you a way to live, fully, healthily, with resources you cannot imagine. And in return, I become a component in your system," Elian said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a bitter irony. "A biological stabilizer. A peripheral. A cornerstone," Kalen corrected him. "The most critical component. The one upon which the entire structure will depend." He let the weight of that statement settle in the silent room. He was offering the man importance, purpose. He was offering him the chance to be essential. What more could a forgotten archivist want? Elian looked away from him, his gaze drifting towards the vast window and the city beyond. For a long moment he was silent, and Kalen allowed it, giving him time to process the inexorable logic of the situation. When Elian finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, almost melancholic. "Have you ever stood in the rain, Mr. Vance?" The question was so out of context, it was jarring. A non sequitur, another data error. "I don't see the relevance," Kalen said, his patience thinning. "When I was a child, before the suppressants, Elian continued, his eyes still on the window. I loved the rain, the smell of it on hot pavement, the sound of it, the feeling of it on your skin. It was chaotic, unpredictable. You could never know if it would be a soft drizzle or a thunderstorm, but it was real. He finally turned his gaze back to Kaelin, and his eyes were clear, the fear replaced by a strange, sorrowful resolve. What you're offering me is a world with no weather, a climate-controlled room where nothing ever changes, where everything is predictable, unstable, and dead. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Vance, but I would rather stand in the rain. He turned and walked towards the doors. Kaelin watched him go, a cold knot of something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. It was not anger. It was fascination. He had presented a flawless argument. He had appealed to logic, to self-preservation, to ambition. And Elian Thorne had countered it with a metaphor about rain. It was the most illogical, inefficient, and utterly human thing he had ever encountered. And it was infuriating. The smoked glass doors slid shut behind Elian, leaving Kaelin alone in the silent, climate-controlled perfection of his office. He looked at the contract still hovering in the air, the glowing line for the price still empty. He had believed that everything and everyone had a price, a quantifiable value that could be met, a lever that could be pulled. Elian Thorne had just suggested otherwise. For a moment, Kaelin considered letting him go, deleting the file, forgetting the impossible 99.8% and the man with the quiet, stubborn defiance. He could return to his life of optimized order. It would be the logical thing to do. But as he stood there, surrounded by his empire of control, he was forced to admit a new, unwelcome truth. The system was no longer enough. He had glimpsed a variable he could not account for, a problem he could not solve with logic or money. And the most illogical thing of all was that for the first time in his life, he found himself utterly, completely compelled by the chaos. He was a man who solved problems. Elian Thorne had just become the most complex problem he had ever faced. Kaelin Vance did not like unsolved problems. He walked to the window, placing a hand on the cool, unyielding glass. Below, the city sprawled, a network of systems he understood and in many ways controlled. Traffic patterns, financial markets, information flow. All of it was data. All of it could be managed. He would manage this too. Elian Thorne thought he could choose the rain. Kaelin Vance would show him that he was the one who controlled the weather. He turned back to his desk and spoke to the empty room. "Activate Protocol Epsilon," he said, his voice calm and precise. Subject, Elian Thorne. Objective, asset acquisition. The illusion of choice was a luxury. It was time for Mr. Thorne to learn that. The city was a sensory assault. After the profound, pressurized silence of the 117th floor, the cacophony of the street-level concourse was a physical shock. The roar of maglev trains overhead, the layered chatter of 1,000 conversations, the relentless pulse of holographic advertisements flashing across every available surface. It all crashed over Elian in a dizzying wave. He clutched the strap of his satchel, his knuckles white, and tried to regulate his breathing. In, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. The meditative rhythm was a fragile shield against the overwhelming stimulus. He felt exposed, raw. The encounter with Vance had stripped away a layer of his carefully constructed anonymity. He felt as if the man's cold, analytical gaze had imprinted itself on his skin, a brand that everyone on the crowded concourse could see. He kept his head down melting into the river of commuters, just another grey-clad functionary in a city of millions. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He told himself it was paranoia, an aftershock from the meeting. Vance was a CEO, a titan of industry. He would not concern himself further with a defiant archivist. He was a statistical anomaly, an error to be noted and filed away. The business of the world would move on. Kalen Vance would move on. He repeated this to himself like a mantra as the train carried him towards his residential sector, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a comforting counterpoint to the frantic beating of his heart. His apartment was his sanctuary, a small one-bedroom unit on the 47th floor of a nondescript residential spire. It was sparsely furnished, the colors muted, the surfaces clear. His only indulgence was books, real books, with paper pages and stitched bindings, filled shelves that lined an entire wall. They were relics, artifacts from a time before everything was data. Their scent of aged paper, ink, and dust was his only permissible perfume. It was the smell of quiet, of solitude, of history that could be held in his hands. He shed his work clothes, leaving them in a pile by the door like a skin he was desperate to slough off. In the small, sterile bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back was pale, his eyes wide with a residual fear that angered him. He saw the faint, dark circles beneath them, the toll of a life spent in a state of low-grade, constant vigilance. He saw the subtle tension in his jaw that never truly went away. This was the face of his freedom. Vance's words echoed in his mind. A cage of your own making. Was he right? Had he traded one prison for another? He turned on the water, letting it run until it was scalding hot, and stepped into the shower. He scrubbed at his skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the feeling of Vance's presence, the memory of that cold, sharp scent that had threatened to awaken things he had buried for a lifetime. He was not a component. He was not an asset. He was a person. The thought felt thin, unconvincing, even to himself. The next morning, the first crack appeared in the foundation of his carefully managed world. He arrived at the archive to find his terminal locked. A small, pulsing message glowed on the screen. Security clearance requires re-evaluation. Please see administration. Ilyas looked over at him, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. They were here this morning, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Corporate security. They imaged your workstation. Corporate security. In the archive. It was unheard of. They were a forgotten department, a digital cemetery. They had nothing of value to secure. Nothing except the employment records of one alien Thorn. The administrator, a nervous, balding man named Phoenix, couldn't meet his eyes. He fidgeted with a stylus, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Elian's left shoulder. There's been a system-wide restructuring, Elian, he stammered. Your position has been flagged as redundant. Redundant, Elian repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. I'm the only one who knows the pre-digital indexing system. Yes. Well, they're migrating everything to a new neural network. It's all automated now. Your skills are obsolete. Phoenix's discomfort was palpable. He was a bad liar. The company is offering a severance package, of course. Standard. Enough to live on for 2 months. 3, if he was frugal. Not nearly enough to maintain the cost of his suppressants long term. This wasn't a restructuring. It was a targeted strike. It was Kalen Vance. The message was clear. You are a part of my system whether you like it or not. I can delete you." He walked out of the Vance Tower for the last time, not with the frantic fear of the day before, but with a cold, clear anger settling in his gut. He had been naive to think Vance would simply let it go. A man like that didn't see people. He saw assets and liabilities. Elian had made himself a liability. The next blow fell 2 days later. An official notice from his building's management corporation appeared on his door. His lease, which was due for its bi-annual renewal, had been terminated. The reason cited was a new community standards clause that his single occupancy status apparently violated. The clause had not existed a week ago. He read the notice 3 times, the clinical, impersonal language a thin veil for the brutal efficiency of the attack. His job, his home. Vance was systematically dismantling his life, brick by brick. He was demonstrating with chilling precision that the freedom Elian cherished was entirely dependent on systems Vance himself controlled. He was being herded, corralled, his options stripped away one by one until only one path remained. The one that led back to the 117th floor. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamt of drowning in a sea of data, of code wrapping around his limbs like seaweed, pulling him down into a cold, silent abyss. He dreamt of a sterile room with a window looking out onto a city of light and the feeling of a calm, grey gaze watching him, waiting for him to break. He woke up gasping, the scent of ozone sharp and clear in his memory. He felt a phantom chill on his skin, the ghost of a presence that was miles away, yet felt terrifyingly close. It was a psychic static, an echo of the connection his body screamed for and his mind abhorred. The bond. It wasn't just a biological concept. It was a bridge, and even unformed, a shadow of it was beginning to stretch between them across the city. The realization terrified him more than losing his job or his apartment. Vance wasn't just attacking his life, he was invading his mind. His last line of defense was the suppressants. He checked his supply, a little over a month left. His physician, a quiet, cautious man who never asked too many questions, had always renewed his prescription without issue. When he called the clinic, he was put on hold. For 20 minutes, he listened to the soothing, synthesized music, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Finally, a new voice, a crisp and unfamiliar nurse, came on the line. "Mr. Thorne, we're calling about your prescription for V-Suppressant 7.0. There's been a flag on your file. Given your unique biological markers, we can no longer authorize this prescription without a full workup and consultation at our central campus." "Your central campus?" Elian asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, the main clinic, at Vance Tower." The line went dead. Checkmate. He stood in the middle of his small, quiet apartment, surrounded by his books, the last vestiges of his life. Vance had taken his job, his home, and now his medicine. He had cut off every avenue of escape. He had left him with a single, stark choice: surrender to the chaos of his own biology, or surrender to Kalian Vance. In the end, was there any difference? He looked at his hands. They were trembling again, but this time it was not just with fear. It was with a rage so profound it felt like a physical force. He was not a problem to be solved. He was not a component to be installed. He would not be broken down and assimilated. He picked up his satchel, his movements sharp and deliberate. He had one last option. It was a desperate, foolish gamble, a relic from a past he had tried to bury even deeper than his biology. It was a life he had run from, but it had taught him how to disappear. Vance thought he had him cornered. He thought he had taken everything, but he hadn't taken the memories of the shadows, the back alleys, the forgotten spaces between the gleaming towers of the city. He hadn't taken the knowledge of how to become a true ghost, not just a chemical one. The descent was a journey back in time. Elian bypassed the gleaming, efficient maglev system and took the old service elevators, the ones that smelled of ozone and lubricant and were used by maintenance drones and sanitation crews. He moved through the city's underbelly, the warren of tunnels and walkways that formed the circulatory system beneath the pristine arteries of the upper levels. Here, the air was thick with the smell of recycled water, hot metal, and the unsanitized scent of too many people living too close together. The holographic ads were gone, replaced by peeling posters and graffiti. The light was a perpetual, jaundiced twilight cast by aging fluorescent tubes. It was a world away from the cold, clean heights of Vance Tower, and it was the world he had been born into. He had spent the first 10 years of his life here, before his parents had scraped together enough credits to move up, to chase the illusion of a better life, an illusion that had led them straight to a Vance Biometrics clinical trial from which they never returned. He pushed the memory down. It was a wound that had never healed, a raw place he could not afford to touch. Not now. His destination was a small, cluttered electronics shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of Sector Gamma 7. The sign above the door was a flickering, half-dead hologram that read, Kai's Curios. The window was crammed with obsolete tech, data slates with cracked screens, tangled nests of fiber optic cables, ancient processing units the size of his head. It looked like a junk shop. It was a front. The man behind the counter was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes obscured by a pair of thick, magnifying goggles perched on his forehead. He didn't look up when Elian entered, the chime of the door barely registering over the sound of his soldering iron. If it's not on the shelf, I don't have it, Kai grunted, his voice a gravelly rasp. I need a ghost, Elian said, his voice low. The soldering iron went still. Kai slowly lifted his head, pushing the goggles up into his shock of white hair. His eyes, small and sharp, appraised Elian for a long, silent moment. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and trusted nothing. Ghosts are expensive, he said finally, and I don't see a man with credits standing in front of me. I have something else, Elian said. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was a first edition of poetry from the pre-digital age, a rarity he had treasured for years. He placed it gently on the counter. Kai picked it up, his calloused fingers surprisingly delicate as he handled the fragile volume. He ran a thumb over the worn cover, then opened it, his eyes scanning the printed words. A flicker of something, nostalgia perhaps, or just professional appreciation, crossed his face. This is real, he murmured. Real paper, real ink. It's worth more than the credits, Elian said. Kai closed the book and pushed it back across the counter. Keep it. A man needs to hold on to something real. He turned and disappeared into the back of the shop. He returned a moment later with a small metallic card, no bigger than Elian's thumbnail. New ident chip, blank slate. You get one chance to upload a profile. Once it's in, it's in. It'll pass any low-level security scan. Don't try to get into any corporate servers or government buildings with it. He dropped the chip into Elian's palm. It was cool and smooth. "I also need passage out of the city," Elian said. "To the outer territories." Kai snorted. "Now you're asking for miracles. Nobody goes to the territories unless they're running from something they can't outrun." "I can pay." Elian gestured to the bookshelf in his mind, the collection he had spent a lifetime curating. "I have more. A lot more." Kai was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. "There's a cargo hauler," he said at last. "Leaves from the Westport docks tomorrow night. Row 200. It's carrying industrial waste for reprocessing. Not a pleasant ride. They'll take you, but they'll take everything you have. You'll arrive with nothing but the clothes on your back and that chip in your neck." "That's all I need," Elian said. He left the shop with the chip in his pocket, a cold knot of hope and fear in his stomach. He was erasing himself. Elian Thorne, the archivist, would cease to exist. He would become a ghost, a no-one, heading for the lawless, forgotten lands outside the city's jurisdiction. It was a terrifying prospect, but it was a choice. His choice. Back in his apartment, he began to pack. Not clothes, not possessions. He packed his books. He carefully wrapped each one in cloth and placed them in sturdy boxes. It felt like he was packing up pieces of his own soul. These books were his history, his only connection to a world beyond the sterile confines of the city. He would sell them to Kai, every last one, to buy his passage into nothingness. The transaction felt like a final, brutal amputation. As he worked, a strange feeling began to creep over him, a low-level hum of anxiety that was not his own. It was a foreign emotion, an invasive frequency that seemed to emanate from the city itself. He tried to shake it off, blaming it on his own stress, the lack of sleep. But it grew stronger, coalescing into a sharp, piercing spike of... what? Frustration? Fury. It was a cold, controlled rage, and it was aimed directly at him. He stood up, a book clutched in his hand, and looked towards the window, towards the distant needle-point spire of Vance Tower. A cold dread washed over him. He could feel him. Kalen Vance was looking for him. And he was not happy. The feeling was so strong, so palpable, it was like a physical presence in the room. The psychic static he had felt before was now a directed beam of intense, focused energy. The unformed bond between them was acting as a conduit, a psychic tether that Vance was now pulling on with all his considerable will. Elian stumbled back, dropping the book. He pressed his hands to his temples, a wave of dizziness and nausea washing over him. It felt like his own mind was being invaded, his thoughts sifted through by an unseen intruder. He had to get out. Now. He abandoned the books, grabbing only his satchel with the ident chip and the last of his credits. He ran from the apartment, not daring to look back, the feeling of that cold, relentless pursuit chasing him down the hallway. He didn't take the elevator. He took the emergency stairs, his footsteps echoing in the concrete well. He ran down 47 flights of stairs, his lungs burning, his legs aching, driven by a primal fear he had never known. The feeling of Vance's mind searching for him was a physical pressure, a hunter's intent that promised capture, not harm. It was the dispassionate, relentless focus of a collector pinning a rare specimen to a board. When he finally burst out into the lower-level service corridors, he was gasping for air, his body trembling. The psychic pressure lessened slightly with distance, but it was still there, a faint thrumming at the base of his skull. He had, one day, he had to stay hidden, to become invisible in the crowded underbelly of the city until the cargo hauler left. He found a capsule hotel, a grimy place where transients and laborers paid for a few hours of sleep in coffin-sized pods. He paid in cash, using a false name, and sealed himself inside the tiny, claustrophobic space. He lay in the darkness, the recycled air hissing from a small vent, and tried to calm his racing heart. He focused on the feeling of the ident chip in his pocket. It was his key, his escape, but as the hours crawled by, a new and more terrifying sensation began to emerge. A warmth spreading through his limbs, a heightened sensitivity in his skin, a deep, aching need coiling in his gut. His suppressants. They were starting to fail. The stress, the physical exertion, the constant psychic pressure from Vance. It was all accelerating the breakdown of the chemical walls he had so carefully maintained. Faintly, for the first time in 15 years, he could smell his own scent. It was green and earthy, like crushed herbs after a storm, and it felt like a beacon, a signal flare that would cut through the city's grime and lead Kalen Vance directly to his door. He was running out of time. Kalen stood before the wall of screens in his office, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. The city laid out before him in a schematic of data streams and surveillance feeds had become a hunting ground. For 3 days, he had methodically tracked Elian Thorne's digital footprint. It had vanished. His credit line was untouched. His public transport pass was inactive. His communication lines were silent. The man had simply ceased to exist within the system. It was a masterful disappearing act, illogical, inefficient, and utterly captivating. "Status report," Kalen said, his voice dangerously quiet. A disembodied, synthesized voice responded from a hidden speaker. "Subject Elian Thorne's employment terminated. Lease agreement voided. Prescription authorization revoked. All known assets are frozen. He has not accessed any personal or public networks in 73.4 hours. And the physical search? Facial recognition sweeps are active on all public CCTVs. Agents are monitoring transport hubs. No positive identification has been made." Kalen felt a cold, unfamiliar frustration coiling in his gut. It was an emotion he despised, a sign of a loss of control. He had applied precise, overwhelming pressure, expecting a logical outcome. Capitulation. Instead, the subject had broken the rules of the game, slipping off the board entirely. He was used to variables he could quantify and predict. Elian Thorne was behaving like chaos theory personified, and yet there was a connection, a faint, persistent thrum at the edge of his perception. It had started as a subtle static after their meeting, a low-level distraction he had dismissed as a psychosomatic anomaly. But now it was growing stronger. It was a thread of awareness, a psychic resonance that hummed with a frequency he was beginning to recognize. It felt like distress, like fear, like a desperate, stubborn defiance. It was Elian. Kalen closed his eyes, shutting out the streams of data on the screens. He focused inward, following that faint, invisible thread. It was like trying to hear a single instrument in a cacophonous orchestra, but his concentration was absolute. He had spent his life learning to master his own mind, to build walls against the psychic noise of the city, the chaotic emotions of the millions of people around him. It was why he craved control, why he built systems. It was a defense mechanism. Now, for the first time, he was using that sensitivity not as a shield, but as a weapon, a tracking device. He pushed his awareness along the thread, trying to get a sense of direction, of location. The signal was faint, diffuse, buried under layers of urban density. It was somewhere low, deep in the foundations of the city. He felt a flash of an image, not his own. A cramped, dark space, the smell of stale air and unwashed bodies, a feeling of being buried alive. And beneath it all, a rising tide of panic as a long-suppressed biological process began to reassert itself. Kalen's eyes snapped open. The suppressants. They were failing. Of course, the pressure he had applied was not just financial and social. It was psychological. Stress was a known catalyst for hormonal imbalance. He had, in his attempt to corner his quarry, inadvertently triggered the one thing he had sought to control, a preheat. It would not be a full, debilitating cycle. Not yet. But the chemical walls were crumbling. Elian's scent, the one the scanners had registered as a dormant but exceptionally potent genetic marker, would begin to emerge. Subtle at first, but to a prime alpha with a 99.8% compatibility match, it would be a flare in the darkness. Change search parameters, Kalen commanded, his voice sharp with a new urgency. Discontinue facial recognition sweeps. They are useless. Deploy atmospheric sensors to the lower sectors. Grid pattern. I want real-time analysis of all anomalous pheromonal signatures. Filter for Omega profile G77. Cross-reference with the subject's genetic markers. Prioritize sector gamma. The AI processed the command without comment. On the main screen, a map of the city's lower levels lit up, a grid overlaying the labyrinthine network of tunnels and corridors. Small sensor drones, no bigger than insects, would be deployed from sanitation vents and service conduits, silently tasting the air. It was a needle in a haystack, but Kalen Vance had just magnetized the needle. He felt a grim satisfaction. The hunt had entered a new, more primal phase. It was no longer about data and networks. It was about scent and instinct. And in that arena, he was unmatched. A sharp, insistent chime broke his concentration. It was his private line. Only one person used it. His father. He accepted the call, and a life-sized hologram of a handsome, silver-haired man materialized in the center of the room. Elias Vance looked like an older, softer version of Kalen, but his eyes held the same sharp, calculating intelligence. Kalen, Elias began, his voice smooth and patrician. I've been reviewing the quarterly reports. Impressive growth in the biotech division. However, I've also been reviewing your recent security directives. An unprecedented level of domestic surveillance. Atmospheric sensors. That's a significant expenditure of resources. Care to explain what merits this city-wide manhunt? A corporate security matter, Kalen said, his tone clipped. An asset with a unique biological profile has gone missing. Elias raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. An asset? Or an Omega? I'm still on the board, son. I see the flags in the compatibility database. 99.8%. I thought it was a system glitch. It is not a glitch, Kalen confirmed. And he refused the bonding contract. Elias let out a soft, incredulous laugh. Refused? A low-level archivist refused you. Perhaps you've lost your touch. The condescension in his father's voice was a familiar irritant. His name is Elian Thorne, Kalen said, deliberately changing the subject. His file is sparse. He has been on suppressants since he was 10. No family listed. At the name, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his father's expression. A flicker of something that looked like recognition, or perhaps alarm. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual urbane composure. But Kalen had seen it. Thorne, Elias repeated, testing the name on his tongue. No, Doesn't ring a bell. Well, I trust you'll handle it. A prime alpha of your standing can't be seen to be rejected. It sets a bad precedent. The hologram flickered and vanished, leaving Kalen alone once more in the silent room. Father was lying. He knew the name. The certainty of it settled in Kalen's mind, cold and hard. He turned back to the console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. He pulled up his father's private archives, using an override code he hadn't employed in years. He initiated a search. Keyword: Thorn. The system cross-referenced 2 decades of encrypted files. After a moment, a single file was returned. Project Chimera, dated 25 years ago, highly classified. It was one of the earliest research projects on enhanced bond compatibility, run by Vance Biometrics under his father's direct supervision. He opened the file. It was filled with clinical data, test subjects identified only by numbers, but attached to the file was a secondary document, a legal release form signed by 2 individuals, a low-level alpha engineer named Alistair Thorne and his Omega mate, Lena Thorne. They were volunteering for a procedure designed to enhance the genetic potential of their offspring for high-order compatibility. Kalen's blood ran cold. He scanned further down. The project had been a catastrophic failure. Most of the test subjects had suffered severe neurological damage. The Thorns were listed as deceased. Cause of death: neural feedback cascade during the final phase of the trial. And there was one final addendum. The offspring, a male child named Elian, aged 5, had survived. He had been placed in the state ward system, his connection to the project scrubbed from all official records. The boy who grew up to be a ghost had been made one by his own father. Kalen stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place with sickening precision. Elian's impossible compatibility score wasn't a miracle of nature. It was the result of an illegal, unethical experiment. His parents hadn't just died. They had been killed by this company, by his family. And Elian's lifelong flight from his own biology, his obsessive need for anonymity, it wasn't a choice. It was a trauma response, a deep, primal scream against the system that had created him and then orphaned him. A sudden, sharp alert blared from the main console, a flashing red light on the map of Sector Gamma 7. Pheromonal signature detected. Match probability 99.9%. Location locked. He had found him. But the nature of the hunt had changed. This was no longer about acquiring an asset. It was no longer about solving a puzzle. A cold, possessive fury, deeper and more potent than any he had ever felt, washed through him. Elian Thorne was not just a compatible Omega. He was a product of the Vance legacy. He was a living, breathing testament to his father's sins. He belonged to Kalen, not by contract, not by biology, but by right of inheritance. He would not be Elian's captor. He would be his salvation. He would tear him from the shadows, from the legacy of his father's cruelty, and place him in a gilded cage of his own making, where nothing and no one could ever hurt him again. The distinction was, in his mind, a critical one. The walls of the capsule were closing in. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a psychological one. Every hiss of the air vent, every distant rumble of the city's machinery, every muffled cough from a neighboring pod sounded like the approach of a hunter. Elian lay on the thin mattress, his body coiled into a tight knot, drenched in a cold sweat. The heat was building. It was not the violent, all-consuming fever he had read about, the kind that obliterated thought and reason. This was a slow burn, a creeping warmth that started deep in his bones and radiated outward. His senses were sharpening, becoming painfully acute. He could smell the mildew in the ventilation system, the synthetic protein in the nutrient paste the man in the next pod was eating, the faint tang of anxiety sweating from the pores of a dozen other transients hidden in the wall. The sensory input was overwhelming, a cacophony of information his brain no longer had the chemical dampers to filter, and beneath it all, his own scent was blooming, a faint, sweet perfume of rain-soaked earth and wild things. To him, it smelled like terror. It smelled like a beacon. He tried to focus on his breathing, on the cold, hard reality of the ident chip he clutched in his fist. EO-200, the cargo hauler. He just had to make it to the Westport docks. A few more hours of hiding, of being small and silent and invisible. But the feeling of being hunted had not subsided. If anything, it had grown more focused, more intense. The diffuse, city-wide pressure had coalesced into a sharp, probing point of awareness that seemed to be methodically sweeping the lower sectors. He could feel Kalen Vance's will, his relentless, analytical mind, sifting through the chaos of the Undercity, searching for his specific frequency. It was a violation of the most profound kind, an intrusion into his very being. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, pinned and unable to escape the unblinking eye of the scientist. A sudden, piercing spike of energy shot through him, so intense it made him gasp. It was a wave of pure, cold fury, and it was not his own. It was Kalen's, and it was followed by a jolt of something else, something that felt like recognition, realization. He knows. The thought slammed into Elian's mind with the force of a physical blow. He doesn't know how, but he knows. About my parents, about the project. The psychic tether that linked them, fragile and unwanted, had just transmitted a burst of raw, unfiltered emotion. Kalen Vance's cold, controlled world had been shaken, and the aftershocks were vibrating down the line to Elian. This changed everything. This was no longer a business transaction. It was personal. Vance wasn't just hunting a compatible Omega anymore. He was hunting a piece of his own family's sordid history. A loose end, a ghost from a past he had perhaps not even known existed until now. The door to his capsule, a thin sheet of reinforced plastic, suddenly seemed laughably inadequate. He had to move. He scrambled out of the pod, his movements clumsy, his limbs feeling strangely heavy. He stumbled out into the grimy corridor of the Capsule Hotel. The bored-looking attendant barely glanced up from his data slate. Elian forced himself to walk, not run, towards the exit. He needed to blend in, to be just another shadow in a city of shadows. The moment he stepped out into the main concourse of Gamma 7, he knew he had made a mistake. The air, thick with the sense of food stalls, unwashed bodies, and industrial fumes, was now laced with something else. A new smell, clean and sterile and utterly out of place. An antiseptic, a tracer compound. He saw them then. Small, insect-like drones, no bigger than his thumb, hovering almost invisibly near the ceiling vents. They moved with a silent, purposeful grace, their multi-faceted optical sensors glowing with a faint red light. Atmospheric sensors. Kalen wasn't looking for him anymore. He was sniffing for him. His blood ran cold. He pulled the collar of his jacket up, trying to shield his face, to contain his scent. A futile gesture. He plunged into the thickest part of the crowd, letting the mass of bodies swallow him. He moved with the current, a piece of driftwood in a human river, his destination the same, the Westport docks. But now, it was a race. He could feel the net tightening. The drones were a physical manifestation of Vance's will, a systematic, grid-by-grid search that would inevitably find him. The journey to the docks was a nightmare of paranoia. Every person who glanced at him was an agent. Every security drone that passed overhead was scanning for him. The psychic pressure at the base of his skull was a constant, throbbing ache. He felt exposed, naked, his own biology betraying him with every breath. The Westport was a place of organized chaos. Towering cranes moved like prehistoric beasts, lifting and stacking massive cargo containers. The air was thick with the smell of salt, rust, and fuel. Ground crews in oil-stained jumpsuits swarmed over the docking pads, their shouts lost in the roar of engines. It was the perfect place to disappear. Elian found the designated berth. The cargo hauler was a monstrosity of pitted, rust-streaked metal, its hull scarred from 1,000 journeys. Its name, the Wanderer, was barely visible under layers of grime. It was ugly, functional, and beautiful. It was his escape. He saw a man leaning against a stack of crates, a data slate in his hand, checking off a manifest. He matched the description Kai had given him. The captain. Elian approached him, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm here for the passage," he said, his voice low. The captain, a burly man with a thick graying beard, looked him up and down, his expression unreadable. "You got the fare?" Elian nodded, reaching for the satchel where he had the credits from the sale of his books. A sudden, blindingly bright light flooded the docking bay. Elian flinched, throwing an arm up to shield his eyes. Several sleek black vehicles had silently converged on their position, their headlights cutting through the gloom. They were unmarked, but their purpose was unmistakable. Corporate security. Men in black tactical gear began to emerge, moving with a fluid, disciplined efficiency. They did not raise their weapons. They did not shout. They simply formed a perimeter, cutting off all avenues of escape. Their movements were calm, precise, and utterly terrifying. From the lead vehicle, a single figure emerged. Kalen Vance. He was dressed in a long, dark coat that billowed around him in the port wind. He stood there, bathed in the harsh glare of the headlights, his pale grey eyes fixed on Elian. He looked like a god of the underworld, come to claim a stray soul. The psychic pressure that had been a dull ache in Elian's skull exploded into a deafening roar. It was no longer a search. It was a declaration, a claim. Mine. The word was not spoken, but it slammed into Elian's mind with the force of a physical impact. It was raw, possessive, absolute. Elian took an involuntary step back, his hand frozen halfway to his satchel. The captain of the Wanderer wisely took several steps in the opposite direction, raising his hands in a universal gesture of non-involvement. "Elian," Kalen said. His voice was calm, but it cut through the noise of the port with ease. It was the voice of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed by the universe itself. "This has gone on long enough." Elian's rising heat, stoked by fear and stress, chose that moment to crest. A wave of dizziness washed over him, his knees threatening to buckle. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the harsh lights of the vehicles blurring into streaks. His scent, which had been a subtle perfume, now poured from him in a desperate, potent wave. It was the scent of fear, of defiance, and of a deep, biological need that horrified him. He saw Kalen's nostrils flare just for an instant. He saw the iron control in his posture falter for a fraction of a second as the full, undiluted force of their 99.8% compatibility hit him. In that moment, He was not a CEO. He was a prime alpha who had just found the one thing in the universe his body was designed to respond to. "It's over," Kalen said, his voice now rougher, a low growl underpinning the cultured words. He took a step forward. "You are coming with me." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Elian looked from Kalen's implacable face to the dark, ugly form of the wanderer. Freedom was so close he could taste the rust and salt on the air. But between him and that freedom stood a man who controlled the world. A man who was tied to him by the sins of his father and the tyranny of his own biology. He had one last choice: surrender, or a final, desperate act of defiance. His body screamed for him to yield, to give in to the heat, to the crushing force of the Alpha's presence, to the promise of safety and stability that Kalen represented. But the part of him that had survived the wards, the part that had curated a life from the ashes of his past, the part that loved the chaos of the rain, refused to break. He turned and ran. The decision to run was not a product of thought. It was pure, unadulterated instinct, a flight response that overrode the crushing weight of Kalen's presence and the traitorous pull of his own biology. He scrambled over a stack of coolant hoses, his feet slipping on the grimy permacrete, his only thought to put distance, any distance, between himself and the man who was both his history and his potential future. The security team moved to intercept, their movements economical and precise. They didn't rush. They flowed like a tide of black uniforms, positioning themselves to cut off his path. They were herding him, not chasing him. Kalen did not move. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as Elian's desperate flight led him exactly where they wanted him to go, into a narrow, dead-end alley between two colossal stacks of cargo containers. The alley was a canyon of rusted metal, the only light the cold, distant stars and the reflected glare from the docks. Elian pressed himself back against the cold, corrugated wall, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He was trapped. The heat was a roaring fire in his blood now, his thoughts fragmenting, his body trembling with a mixture of terror and agonizing need. He could smell Kalen approaching. The clean, sharp scent of ozone and cold steel cut through the briny air of the port, an olfactory signature of absolute power. It was a scent that should have terrified him, but his body, his treacherous Omega biology, responded with a wave of longing so intense it made him sick. Kalen appeared at the mouth of the alley, a dark silhouette against the brighter lights of the docks. He walked forward, slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing off the metal walls. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that Elian could see the faint tightening of his jaw, the immense control he was exerting over his own primal instincts. "There is nowhere else to run, Elian," he said, his voice a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in Elian's very bones. This was always the only possible outcome. "Stay away from me," Elian gasped, the words barely a whisper. He tried to project defiance, but his voice was thin, reedy, undermined by the tremor in his body. Kalen took another step, closing the distance between them. The air grew thick, charged with an almost visible tension. It was a storm of pheromones, a silent, violent conversation happening on a level far below language. Elian's scent was a desperate plea for both rescue and release. Kalen's was a calming, dominant blanket of absolute assurance and possession. Safe. Mine. Protected. "I know about your parents," Kalen said, his voice softening fractionally. I know what my father's company did to them. To you. The words, meant perhaps to be a bridge, an explanation, felt like a brand. They confirmed that he was not just a biological match, but a legacy, a problem to be managed, a sin to be contained. So what is this? Elian spat, finding a sliver of anger in the swirling chaos of his emotions. Penance? Are you trying to buy your family a clean conscience by owning the evidence of its crimes? A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even pain, crossed Kalen's face. This is not about my conscience, he said, his voice regaining its cold edge. This is about restoring order. You are an anomaly, a variable created by my father's chaotic ambition. I am correcting his error. I am putting you where you belong. I don't belong to you, Elian shouted, the sound raw and desperate. He pushed himself off the wall, intending to shove past, to make one last futile attempt at escape. But his legs gave way. The heat, the stress, the chase, it was too much. He collapsed, his body hitting the hard ground with a jarring impact. He was on his hands and knees, helpless, his head spinning. The world narrowed to the grimy permacrete beneath his hands and the overwhelming presence of the alpha before him. Kalen was beside him in an instant, kneeling. He did not touch him. Not yet. He simply held his position, a bastion of calm strength in Elian's spiraling world. Your body knows where you belong, Kalen said, his voice a low murmur, almost gentle. Your mind is stubborn. It clings to a narrative of suffering because it is all it has ever known. Let it go, Elian. Let me give you something else. He finally reached out, his hand moving slowly, giving Elian ample time to pull away. He didn't. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the warring factions within him. Kalen's fingers brushed against his neck, just below his ear. The touch was electric. A jolt of pure, unadulterated energy shot through Elian's system, silencing the frantic noise in his head. For a single, terrifying, blissful moment, there was only a profound sense of peace, a feeling of rightness, of coming home. The bond was a living thing between them, a tangible force that his body had been craving for a lifetime without his mind's permission. He could feel Kalen's own inner turmoil through that nascent connection, the ironclad control warring with a possessive, protective instinct so fierce it was breathtaking. He saw, in a flash of empathic insight, the chaos Kalen fought to keep at bay, the psychic noise of the world that he ordered his life to silence. He understood, in that moment, that Kalen's obsession with control was not about power. It was about survival. And he, Elian, was the ultimate anchor, the ultimate silence. Tears began to stream down Elian's face. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of sheer, overwhelming, emotional overload. He was mourning the loss of the life he had fought for, and simultaneously being pulled into a future he had never wanted, but which his very cells recognized as destiny. I will not be your prisoner, he whispered, the words a final, ragged breath of defiance. Kalen's thumb stroked his skin, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it shattered the last of Elian's resistance. You will not be a prisoner, Kalen said, his voice a solemn vow. You will be the center of my world, and my world will be your fortress. Nothing will ever harm you again. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against Elian's ear. His breath was warm, a stark contrast to his cold scent. The world my father built broke you, he murmured. Now let the world I build remake you. He slid his arms under Elian, lifting him from the ground, as if he weighed nothing. Elian did not fight. He was too exhausted, too overwhelmed. He allowed himself to be gathered into Kalen's arms, his head falling to rest against the solid wall of his chest. He could feel the strong, steady beat of Kalen's heart, a rhythm that was already beginning to calm his own. As Kalen carried him out of the alley and towards the waiting vehicle, Elian looked back one last time at the hulking form of the Wanderer, his escape, his illusion of freedom. It looked small and insignificant now, a relic from a life that was already fading into memory. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not a prisoner. He did not know what he was. But as Kalen Vance placed him gently into the back of the silent, luxurious vehicle, and the door closed, sealing them in a world of quiet and leather, and the overwhelming scent of their combined presence, he knew, with a terrifying and absolute certainty, that he was home. The fight was over. The surrender was complete. Or so he thought. The penthouse was a cage of breathtaking beauty. It occupied the top 3 floors of Vance Tower, a sanctuary of glass and steel and minimalist design suspended in the sky. The views were panoramic, the city a glittering tapestry laid out at their feet. The silence was absolute, the air perfectly filtered and temperature-controlled. It was the climate-controlled room from Elian's metaphor, made real. It was a prison built of peace. In the days that followed his capture, his rescue, Kalen would have called it, Elian drifted in a fog of biological surrender. The heat, which had been stoked by fear and stress, receded into a manageable, simmering warmth under the calming, constant presence of the prime alpha. Kalen was meticulously attentive. He did not initiate a full bonding, did not take what Elian's body was so obviously offering. Instead, he simply existed. His presence was a grounding force, a constant, silent reassurance that seeped into Elian's bones and quieted the frantic hum of his anxiety. He brought Elian food himself, simple, nourishing meals. He sat with him for hours in the vast, white living area, sometimes reading on a data slate, sometimes just watching the city lights, his silence a comfortable weight rather than an oppressive one. He had a physician attend to Elian, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who took his vitals, prescribed nutritional supplements, and spoke in soothing tones about hormonal recovery. She never mentioned the suppressants he was no longer taking. It was a careful, deliberate campaign of pacification. Kalen was demonstrating what life with him would be like. A world without want, without fear, without pain. A world of perfect, ordered tranquility. He was trying to earn the surrender that he had initially been prepared to take by force. Elian allowed it to happen. He was too tired to fight. His body craved the peace, the stability. The psychic tether between them was strengthening each day, a low, constant hum of awareness. He could feel Kalen's moods now, not as intrusive spikes, but as subtle shifts in the emotional atmosphere. He felt the immense satisfaction and focus Kalen derived from his work, the low-level irritation he felt when dealing with his board of directors, and, most powerfully, the profound, grounding calm he seemed to experience whenever he was near Elian. He was, as he had predicted, Kalen's anchor. The realization was both terrifying and strangely empowering. He was not just a passive component in Kalen's system. He was a vital one. The system did not function properly without him, but as his body healed and the hormonal storm subsided, his mind began to re-emerge from the fog. The anger, the defiance, the fierce, protective love he had for his own autonomy. It had not been extinguished. It had merely been dormant. He started to explore the penthouse. It was a marvel of technology and wealth. Rooms materialized from walls with a touch. Food and drink could be synthesized on demand. An entire library of digital books was available at a verbal command. But it was all sterile, all perfect. There were no worn-out armchairs, no dog-eared pages, no dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. There was no life. There was no weather. One afternoon, he found Kalen's office. It was a smaller, more intimate version of the one on the 117th floor. But it had the same wall of glass, the same obsidian desk, the same aura of absolute control. Kalen was there, engrossed in a complex holographic projection of market data. He did not seem to notice Elian's presence at first. Elian stood in the doorway, watching him. He saw the tension in Kalen's shoulders, the faint line of concentration between his brows. He could feel the immense cognitive load Kalen was under, the sheer force of will it took to manage an empire of that magnitude. And he could feel, through their connection, how his own quiet presence at the edge of the room was subtly smoothing out the rough edges of Kalen's focus, like a harmonic resonance cancelling out a discordant frequency. "What my father did was wrong," Kalen said suddenly, without looking up from his work. It was an act of reckless, arrogant pride. He saw people as data points in his ambition, a flaw I have tried very hard not to inherit. "And what do you see me as?" Elian asked, his voice quiet but clear. Kalen finally looked up, his grey eyes meeting Elian's. He swiped a hand through the air, and the holographic display vanished. He gave Elian his full, undivided attention. "I see you as the solution," he said simply, "to a problem I didn't know I had until I met you. The psychic noise, the chaos of the world. It's a constant distraction, a drain on my resources. With you, it's quiet." He gestured around the pristine, silent room. "This order I've built is a shield. You are a better one." The honesty was disarming. He was not trying to dress his motives in the language of love or romance. He was stating a fact. Elian was his perfect, biological, noise-cancelling machine. "And what do I get in return?" Elian asked. "A comfortable cage? A life as a living tranquilizer?" "You get safety," Kalen countered, his voice even. "You get a world where no one can ever touch you, or use you, or throw you away. You get a partner who understands, on a fundamental level, what it is to be a product of a flawed system. I am not my father, Elian. I will not hurt you." "You already have," Elian said softly. "You took my life. You took my choices." Kalen stood and walked around the desk until he was standing in front of him. He did not try to touch him. "I took an illusion," he said. "The life you had was a slow suicide, fueled by a trauma you were never allowed to process. The choices you had were to fade away in a basement or run until you collapsed. I am offering you a third choice, a real one. Build a new life, with me." He gestured to the desk. "I am dismantling my father's legacy. The men who ran Project Chimera, the ones who are still with the company, I am systematically removing them. I am auditing every unethical program he ever sanctioned. I am cleaning the slate. Help me. You have a mind for history, for data. Help me uncover the truth. Let us build something better on the ruins of what he broke." It was a brilliant move. He wasn't offering Elian a life of passive comfort. He was offering him a purpose. He was offering him justice. He was offering him a way to reclaim his own history, not by running from it, but by confronting and dismantling the machine that had created it. Elian looked into Kalen's intense, serious eyes. He could feel the sincerity of the offer radiating from him. This was not a trick. This was a genuine proposal, a partnership. But it was a partnership that came with a condition: the bond, the final, irrevocable surrender of his individual self into a merged entity. To accept the purpose, he had to accept the cage, no matter how gilded. "I need to go outside," Elian said, the words a sudden, desperate need. Kalen's brow furrowed. "The penthouse is perfectly climate-controlled. The air is purer than anything outside." "I don't want pure air," Elian said, a note of the old fire returning to his voice. "I want to feel the wind. I want to smell the city. I need weather." Kalen was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He was processing the request, weighing the security risks, the potential for another flight attempt. Elian could feel the internal calculations, the conflict between his protective, controlling instincts and his desire to grant this request. "All right," he said finally. "We will go to the rooftop terrace." It was a compromise, but it was a start, a small crack in the perfect, sealed walls of his new reality. A sign that perhaps this was not a simple dynamic of captor and captive. It was something far more complex and far more dangerous. The rooftop terrace was another masterpiece of controlled nature. Manicured beds of genetically perfected flora, chosen for their lack of pollen and muted scents, were arranged in aesthetically pleasing geometric patterns. A shallow infinity pool reflected the bruised twilight sky. The floor was polished stone, warmed from within. Even the wind seemed tamed, baffled by invisible energy shields that muted its force to a gentle, predictable breeze. It was weather, but it was weather with all the chaos edited out. Kalen stood a respectful distance away, a silent, watchful guardian in a perfectly tailored suit. He had not tried to hold Elian's hand or guide him. He had simply followed him out onto the terrace, his presence a constant, reassuring weight. Elian walked to the edge, to the thick, invisible barrier that separated the terrace from a 1,000-foot drop. He placed his hand against its surface. It was smooth, unyielding, and faintly warm. Below, the city was a breathtaking spectacle of light and motion, its noise a distant, muted roar. He was above it all, untouchable, safe, and completely, utterly disconnected. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the feeling of real rain on his skin, the unpredictable chill of it, the way it smelled, the way it washed the world clean for a few brief moments. Here, in this perfect, sterile environment, the memory felt thin, like a faded photograph. "Is this what you wanted?" Kalen's voice came from behind him, calm and questioning. "Is it enough?" Elian turned to face him. The wind, gentle as it was, stirred his hair. The lights of the city haloed Kalen's imposing figure. In this moment, he did not look like a captor. He looked like a man standing on the pinnacle of his world, offering to share it. "No," Elian said, the word quiet but firm. "It's beautiful, and it's empty." He saw a flicker of disappointment in Kalen's eyes, but it was quickly masked. "What is it that you want, Elian? I can give you anything. Wealth, power, revenge. Name it." The echo of his first offer. Name your price. But the context was different now. Then it had been a transaction. Now it felt like a genuine, if misguided, plea to understand. "I want my books," Elian said. The request was so simple, so mundane, it seemed to hang in the air between them, absurd in its smallness. Kalen frowned. I can give you access to the largest digital library in the world, every book ever written. No, Elian insisted. Not data. I want my books, the ones with the cracked spines and the yellowed pages, the ones that smell of paper and time, the ones I sold to buy my way away from you. He saw a flash of understanding, and something else, something that looked like regret in Kalen's expression. He was beginning to grasp that what Elian missed was not the content, but the reality, the tangible, imperfect, chaotic history of the objects themselves. The things Kalen's world of sterile perfection had no room for. They are gone, Kalen said. The man you sold them to, Kai, his shop was cleared out as part of the search. The contents were impounded, most likely incinerated as unregistered physical media. Incinerated. The word was a physical blow. Elian felt a hollow ache in his chest, a sense of loss so profound it stole his breath. He had lost his parents, his job, his home, his freedom. But the loss of his books felt like the final erasure. They were the last piece of him, of the quiet, solitary person he had been. Now they were just ash. He turned away from Kalen, wrapping his arms around himself. The carefully constructed calm he had maintained for days shattered, and a wave of pure, desolate grief washed over him. He did not cry. He simply stood there, shaking, hollowed out. Kalen took a hesitant step towards him, then stopped. Elian could feel his uncertainty through their connection. His instinct was to control, to fix, to provide a solution. But this was a problem that could not be solved with money or power. It was a wound that could not be healed with logic. He was a man who dealt in systems, and he was confronted with the chaotic, irrational, and utterly human emotion of grief. He was, for once, at a loss. I will find new ones, Kalen said, his voice quiet. First editions. We can build a new collection. A better one. You don't understand, Elian whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. You can't replace a memory. He pushed past Kalen and went back inside, leaving him alone on the terrace with the tamed wind and the silent, glittering city. The interaction, as painful as it was, marked a shift. Kalen seemed to realize that pacification was not enough. Winning Elian over would require more than just providing a safe, beautiful cage. It would require understanding. The next day, Kalen did not go to his office. He brought a data slate into the living area where Elian was sitting and began to work on the Project Chimera files. He did not ask for Elian's help directly. He simply worked openly, occasionally muttering to himself about encrypted files or redacted witness statements. He was inviting Elian in, not with a command, but with a quiet, open door. Curiosity and a deep, burning need for answers eventually won out. Elian moved from the couch to the chair opposite Kalen. What have you found? He asked. Kalen looked up, a flicker of relief in his eyes. He pushed the data slate across the table. My father was more thorough than I thought. Most of the primary researchers are either dead or have disappeared. The data logs are corrupted. But there are payment records, shadow accounts. One name keeps appearing. Dr. Aris Thorne. Thorne? Elian felt a chill. Any relation? He was your father's brother, your uncle. The information landed with a quiet thud. An uncle. He'd grown up believing he had no one. He was the lead geneticist on the project, Kalen continued, his voice grim. According to these records, he raised objections to the final phase, argued it was too dangerous. My father overruled him. After the incident, Aris Thorne vanished. A substantial payment was made to an offshore account, and he disappeared from the system. So he was paid for his silence, Elian said, the words tasting like poison. He let them kill his brother, and then he ran. Perhaps, Kalen said. Or perhaps he was forced out, threatened. There's no way to know unless we find him. A new purpose began to solidify in Elian's mind. Finding Aris Thorn, finding the truth. It was a tangible goal, a focal point in the disorienting new landscape of his life. It was the purpose Kalen had offered him, and he found himself, against his better judgment, wanting to take it. They worked together for hours, sifting through a decade's worth of encrypted data. Elian, with his archivist's mind, saw patterns that Kalen, the systems analyst, missed. He found ghost fragments in deleted files, echoes of conversations in maintenance logs. A strange, professional intimacy grew between them. They were two powerful minds, working in concert, their shared focus a palpable energy in the room. The psychic bond between them seemed to facilitate it, allowing for an almost non-verbal communication. A shared glance, a mutual moment of understanding as they uncovered another piece of the puzzle. For a few hours, Elian forgot he was a captive. He forgot about the bond, about the heat that still simmered beneath his skin. He was a researcher, an archivist, doing what he did best. He was, in a strange way, himself. Late into the night, they found something, a recurring coded reference in Aris Thorn's private logs. It wasn't a location, it was a title, a book, Leaves of Grass, pre-digital poetry. The same book Elian had offered to Kai. A cold realization dawned on him. Kai, the cluttered shop, the reverence for old, real things. I think I know where he is, Elian said softly. Or at least, I know someone who might. He looked at Kalen, and for the first time, he was not looking at his captor. He was looking at his partner, an ally. It was a dangerous, seductive thought. The path to justice for his parents lay through Kalen Vance. To get what he wanted, he had to work with the one man who had taken everything from him. The irony was as bitter as it was unavoidable. To reclaim his past, he had to embrace his present. The return to Sector Gamma 7 was a surreal experience. This time, Elian was not a fugitive scuttling through the shadows. He descended in Kalen's private elevator, a silent express tube that bypassed all public levels and opened directly into a secure underground parking garage. They traveled in one of the sleek, black vehicles, its tinted windows turning the grimy, chaotic undercity into a silent film. He was an observer now, insulated from the world he had so recently been a part of. Kalen sat beside him, a silent, imposing presence. He had not questioned Elian's hunch about Kai, had simply made the arrangements. He trusted Elian's intuition, a fact that was both gratifying and deeply unsettling. The trust was a silken thread, pulling them closer, tightening the invisible bonds between them. Two security guards, dressed in plain clothes but moving with the disciplined grace of soldiers, accompanied them. They were Kalen's shadows, a constant reminder of Elian's status. He was an ally, a partner, but he was not free. Kai's Curios was gone. The storefront was boarded up, the flickering holographic sign dark. A corporate seizure notice was plastered on the door. Kalen had been brutally efficient. They wouldn't have found him, Elian said, more to himself than to Kalen. Kai is a ghost. He would have been gone before the first agent arrived. Then this is a dead end, Kalen stated, his voice flat. No, Elian said, a flicker of an old memory surfacing. He pointed to a faded mural on the wall of the adjacent alley. It was a chaotic splash of colors depicting a stylized forest. That graffiti, it's a marker for a messaging system. The old kind, before the network was universal. He walked into the alley, Kalen and his guards following. He ran his hand along the painted wall, searching for a loose brick he remembered from his childhood. He found it, worked it free, and pulled out a small waterproof cylinder. Inside was a single sheet of flimsy paper and a piece of graphite. A pencil. He wrote a simple message, "Leaves of grass. I need to find the gardener." He added a location, an abandoned subway station 2 sectors over, and a time. He rolled the paper up and put it back in the cylinder, replacing the brick. "Now we wait," he said. They waited in the car, the silence stretching between them. Ilian could feel Kalen's skepticism, his impatience with this archaic, inefficient method of communication. Kalen's world was one of instant data transfer, of satellites and quantum relays. This was a world of patience, of trust, of faith in the unseen connections between people in the shadows. To Ilian, it felt more real than any of Kalen's technology. 2 hours later, one of the guards reported movement. A lone figure, an old man, was making his way towards the dead drop. Was Kai. He retrieved the message, read it, and then, after a moment's hesitation, he put it back and walked away. "He's not coming," Kalen said, a note of finality in his voice. "He's afraid." "No," Ilian said, watching Kai's retreating figure. "He's thinking. He's deciding if I can be trusted." He looked at Kalen. "If we can be trusted." Ilian got out of the car. "Stay here," he told Kalen. "He'll only talk to me." Kalen's jaw tightened. The idea of letting Ilian out of his sight, unprotected, went against every one of his instincts. Ilian could feel the fierce, protective possessiveness rising in him, a psychic wave of protest. "If you come with me, he will disappear forever," Ilian said calmly. "I will not run. You know I won't." He held Kalen's gaze, and it was a test, a demand for trust. After a long, tense moment, Kalen gave a curt nod. The guards remained with him. Ilian walked away from the car, alone. He felt Kalen's attention on him like a physical touch, a tether of anxiety and concern that stretched across the distance. He followed the path Kai had taken, turning into a maze of back alleys. He found the old man waiting for him by a steaming sewer grate. "You have brought the devil to my doorstep," Kai rasped, his eyes darting nervously around them. "Vance." "He's with me," Ilian said. "I need your help. I'm looking for a man. He would have been a customer of yours, a collector. He would have been interested in pre-digital science journals, genetic theory." Kai's expression was guarded. "I have many customers." "His name is Aris Thorn," Ilian said. At the name, Kai flinched. The reaction was all the confirmation Ilian needed. "He's a ghost," Kai said, his voice low. "He paid me a lot of credits a long time ago to help him become one. I haven't heard from him in years." "He's my uncle," Ilian said. "He was there when my parents died. I need to find him." Kai studied Ilian's face, his own expression a mixture of pity and fear. "Some ghosts are meant to stay buried, boy. You go digging them up. You might not like what you find." "I have to know," Ilian insisted. Kai let out a long, weary sigh. He was always paranoid, worried his old employers would find him. He talked about a place, off-grid, a quiet place where a man could tend his garden in peace. He gave Ilian an address. It was in the outer territories, the lawless lands beyond the city's jurisdiction, the very place Ilian had been trying to escape to. When Elian returned to the car, Kalen's relief was a palpable wave. He didn't ask what was said. He simply opened the door for Elian. "I have a location," Elian said as they drove away. "The outer territories." Kalen was silent for a moment. "It's dangerous there. Unregulated. It will take time to arrange for secure transport." "We don't need secure transport," Elian said. "We need to be invisible. We need the Wanderer." Kalen turned to him, his expression incredulous. "The cargo hauler. It's a rust bucket. It's completely unsecured." "It's anonymous," Elian countered. "A corporate shuttle flying into the territories is a target. A garbage scow is just part of the landscape. We need to go in quiet, find him, and get out. Your way is loud. My way is smart." It was a direct challenge to Kalen's entire methodology, to his reliance on overwhelming force and superior technology. Elian was asking him to put his trust in the shadows, in the low-tech, inefficient ways of the world he had left behind. He was asking Kalen to enter his world on his terms, and he was doing it not as a captive, but as a partner, an equal. Kalen stared at him, his grey eyes searching Elian's face. Elian could feel the internal conflict, the battle between his ingrained need for control and the logical, strategic sense of Elian's plan. "The captain will need to be compensated," Kalen said at last. It was his form of agreement, a small victory, but a significant one. Elian had not just suggested a plan, he had asserted his own value, his own expertise. He had proven that he was more than just a biological anchor. He was an asset in his own right. As the car sped silently through the Undercity, back towards the gleaming spire of Vance Tower, Elian felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was a flicker of something close to it, a sense of purpose, a sense of agency. He was returning to the gilded cage, but this time he carried the key to a different door, a door that led out into the wilderness, into the past. And for the first time, he felt that he would not be going through it alone. The bond between them was not just a chain. It was becoming a conduit for something else. Trust, respect, a shared mission. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. The journey on the Wanderer was a study in sensory deprivation and overload. The small passenger cabin Kalen had procured was little more than a storage closet with 2 cots welded to the wall. It smelled of stale hydraulic fluid, recycled air, and the faint metallic tang of rust. The constant low-frequency vibration of the ship's engines seeped into Elian's bones, a physical reminder of their slow, steady progress away from the ordered world of the city. For Kalen, the experience was a special kind of hell. Elian could feel his discomfort as a constant, low-grade psychic static. Kalen Vance, the man who controlled a city from a silent, climate-controlled throne, was now trapped in a vibrating metal box, surrounded by inefficiency and grime. He endured it with a stoic, rigid silence, his posture ramrod straight even as he sat on the edge of the flimsy cot. He had traded his tailored suits for simple, dark, functional clothing, but he still looked profoundly out of place, a king in a peasant's hovel. The psychic noise of the outer territories was different from the city. It was not the layered electronic hum of millions of minds. It was a wilder, more chaotic frequency. The Ichu raw, unfiltered emotions of people living on the edge, desperation, fierce independence, paranoia, and a kind of feral hope. It washed over Kalen in waves, and Elian could feel him constantly reinforcing his mental shields, a task made more difficult without the familiar buffers of his ordered environment. Elian's presence, he knew, was the only thing making it bearable for him. He was the quiet room in the heart of the storm. In the close confines of the cabin, the bond between them intensified. There were no distractions, no work to be done, no vast penthouse to provide the illusion of space. There was only the two of them, the vibration of the ship and the growing hum of their connection. At night, Elian found he could not sleep without the steady, calming presence of Kalen's mind nearby. And he could feel that Kalen, too, drew a profound sense of peace from his proximity, the psychic roar of the world outside fading to a manageable whisper. One night, rocked by the gentle sway of the ship, Elian spoke into the darkness. "Why did you never bond with anyone before?" he asked, the question soft. "The 74.3% match. You said it was functionally inadequate." What did that mean? Kalen was silent for a long time, and Elian thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur, stripped of its usual authority. "It means the connection was incomplete. I could feel her emotions, but they were just more noise, another layer of static. There was no synergy, no quiet. It would have been like sharing a prison cell instead of finding a sanctuary." The admission was a profound one. It reframed Kalen's entire quest not as a search for a perfect asset, but as a desperate search for silence, for peace. "And with me," Elian whispered. "With you," Kalen said, and Elian could feel the absolute sincerity of the words resonate through their bond. The rest of the world disappears. The territory they arrived in was a desolate, windswept landscape of rust-colored mesas and scrubland. The settlement was a haphazard collection of prefabricated buildings and salvaged ship hulls, huddled together against the constant, abrasive wind. There was no central authority, only a loose collection of trading posts, workshops, and bars. It was a place for people who did not want to be found. The address Kai had given them led to a small, isolated hydroponics farm a few miles out from the settlement. It was a single, domed structure, its translucent panels opaque with dust. A small, neatly tended garden of hardy desert plants grew by the entrance, a patch of determined order in the midst of chaotic nature. As they approached, the door to the dome hissed open. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright, artificial light from within. He was older, thinner than the pictures in the file, his hair grey and his face lined with worry. But the resemblance to Elian's father was unmistakable. It was Aris Thorn. He held an old, chemical-based projectile weapon, his hands trembling slightly as he aimed it at them. His eyes, wide with fear, darted from Elian to Kalen. "I knew you would find me one day," he said, his voice a dry, unused rasp. He was looking at Kalen. "Vance." "We are not here to harm you, Dr. Thorn," Kalen said, his voice calm and steady. He made no move, his hands held open and away from his body. Eris's gaze shifted to Elian. His eyes widened further, a look of shocked, pained recognition dawning on his face. "Lena," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "You have her eyes." Elian felt a jolt. He had never known his mother's name. "You are Aris Thorn," Elian said, his own voice unsteady. "I am Elian, Alistair's son." The gun wavered. Aris stared at him, his expression a maelstrom of guilt, grief, and disbelief. "Alistair, they told me the child died. They swore it." "They lied," Kalen said, his voice cold. "Just as they lied about the cause of your brother's death." Aris finally lowered the weapon, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He looked like a man who had been running for 25 years, only to find that his ghosts had finally caught up to him. He led them inside the dome. It was a humid, green jungle of plant life, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and chlorophyll. It was a world of pure, organic life, the polar opposite of Kalen's sterile penthouse. Aris led them to a small, clear area with a table and 2 chairs. He sank into one, his face in his hands. "I tried to stop him," he murmured, his voice muffled. "Your father, Vance. He was obsessed, pushing the technology too far, too fast. The final procedure, I knew it was unstable. The neural feedback loop was too powerful. I warned Alistair. I begged him not to go through with it." "Why did he?" Elian asked, his voice tight. "Why did they volunteer for something so dangerous?" Aris looked up, his eyes swimming with tears. "For you, Elian. Lena had had complications. She couldn't carry another child to term. The project promised to correct the genetic issue. They did it so you could have a sibling. They did it for the family they wanted to build." The simple, devastating truth of it settled in Elian's chest, a heavy, painful weight. His parents' death wasn't a story of ambition or greed. It was a story of love, a misguided, tragic love that had been exploited by a man who saw them only as data. "After they died," Aris continued, his voice hollow, "Elias Vance came to me. He said the project was being buried. He told me the child had died in the cascade. He gave me a choice, a new life, somewhere far away, with enough credits to disappear forever, or a place in the official report as a co-conspirator, with a life sentence in a corporate prison. I was a coward. I ran." He looked at Elian, his face a mask of shame. "I ran, and I left my brother's son to whatever fate they had planned for him." Silence descended on the humid greenhouse. Elian looked at the broken man before him, the uncle he never knew he had. He had come here seeking justice, seeking a target for his rage. But all he found was a man consumed by a lifetime of guilt. He felt Kalen's presence behind him, a solid, grounding force. He could feel Kalen's own cold fury, directed not at Aris, but at the memory of his father. Through their bond, Elian could feel that Kalen's quest for order was not just about silencing the noise in his own head. It was also about atoning for the chaotic, destructive legacy of his name. "I have the complete, unredacted files from Project Chimera," Kalen said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "And now, I have your testimony. It is enough to ruin him, to dismantle everything he built on the bones of your family." Aris looked from Kalen to Elian, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "What do you want from me?" he asked Elian. It was his story, his justice to claim. Elian looked at his uncle, at the life of exile and fear he had lived. He looked at Kalen, the son of the man who had destroyed his family, who was now offering him the tools to do the same in return. The path of revenge was clear, a straight, clean line. But his life had never been clean or straight. He thought of his parents, who had risked everything for the hope of a bigger family, for more love. What would they want? An eye for an eye, or something else? "I don't want to ruin him," Elian said, the words surprising even himself. "I want to erase him. I want the world to know what he did. I want the name Thorn to be remembered not as victims, but as the reason the Vance Corporation was forced to change. I want to use his own system to create something better." He looked at Kalen, a silent challenge in his eyes. "You said you wanted to build something new. Let's do it." Let's use this truth not as a weapon to destroy, but as a foundation to build. Kalen stared at him, and Elian could feel his shock, his surprise, and then a wave of profound, overwhelming respect. He had expected Elian to choose vengeance. He had been prepared to give it to him. But Elian had chosen creation over destruction. He had chosen the future over the past. In that moment, standing in a dusty greenhouse at the edge of the world, something shifted between them, irrevocably. The bond, which had been forged in power and need and shared trauma, was now tempered with something new, a shared purpose, a mutual choice. The board will resist, Kalen said, already thinking strategically. My father still has loyalists. Then we won't go to the board, Elian said, a new, unfamiliar confidence in his voice. We'll go to the public. We'll leak the files, all of them. We will let the world be the judge. It was a chaotic, unpredictable plan, the opposite of everything Kalen Vance stood for. It was, Elian realized with a jolt, a plan that embraced the metaphorical rain. And Kalen, after a moment's consideration, gave a slow, deliberate nod. All right, he said. Let's make it storm.